So I guess it's time to begin. Hello, everybody. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I hope you're all having a beautiful day. Here in Ottawa, it's actually quite rainy and tiring. So we're 7:30 p.m. and I think everybody from the East Coast is getting a bit tired, but we'll go ahead anyways. This webinar tonight is going to be quite interesting. And I'm very excited for it because I had the opportunity to go to Edmonton for the first time last year and met with Farooq Maseehuddin, who actually gave me a lot of insight on building meaningful community. And so that'll be something that he'll address and talk about in this webinar. So a bit on Farooq Maseehuddin. He is a high school English teacher and a graduate student in the Department of Educational Policy Studies at the University of Alberta in Canada. Farooq is also the founder of Tarjuma, an intentional Muslim community plant in Edmonton. So essentially, he'll explain to you a bit what is a community plant. And so what we're doing is we're hoping to have you all get a better understanding on creating a meaningful spaces. And so we're hoping that you could learn a lot from how to build community, how to create intentional community, how to have bring people together to create meaningful outward local change, but also inner spiritual change. So without further ado, I present to you Farooq.
Stefan, can you see me?
I can see you.
Awesome. Okay, so hopefully everyone else.
Can everybody see Farooq? I assume that's a yes.
Cool. All right. Sounds good. Thank you very much, Stefan, for having me. I want to thank Project Communitas for hosting me, and thank everyone for joining us as we begin a little bit of an exploration around notions of community, notions of institutions, and some other things that have caught my interest over the past several years, actually. I'm going to switch over to my next screen, and I'm going to take us through a presentation that hopefully won't be too long, and then we'll jump back to some live video thereafter. So give me one moment. I'm just going to make sure that I am great. So hopefully you can all see my screen, and if not, I anticipate that I'll get a message from Stefan indicating otherwise. So before I begin my presentation in earnest, just a brief word on the title of today's webinar. The quote, "Whatever the issue, community is the answer," is a quote by Margaret Wheatley, who's an American writer and management consultant who studies organizational behavior. I heard this quote last year, and it's really stuck with me ever since. And it's increasingly resonated with me since I first heard it. And the reasons for why it resonates with me, I hope, become clear as we lay out some of my journey over the next few slides. Questions around the definition of community began for me around 10 years ago when I was completing my undergraduate degree at the University of Alberta. I was a fairly active kid growing up in the Muslim community in Edmonton, and when I entered university, I fell right into a very well-connected and what seemed like a very well-rooted Muslim students community at that university. My connection with that community was so strong that I didn't feel the need to connect to any real depth with anyone else. I had acquaintances and connections with folks who were not Muslim, but my community was a group of Muslim students who I had met either before my time at the university or met at my time, beginning my time at the university. And that situation for me worked out quite well because that's where, amongst other things, but probably most importantly, I met my wife, Salwa, who came from a different ethno-cultural background than me. My parents immigrated to Canada from Hyderabad in the 60s and 70s, and Salwa's mother was born in Edmonton, and her father also immigrated to Canada around the same time my parents did. So she was sort of a third-generation Lebanese Canadian. But our connection to one another through the context of us being very active members of this Muslim students group really helped our relationship take root and eventually facilitated us getting married. And after getting married, Salwa and I graduated with both degrees in education and moved to teach internationally in Kuwait, and we would live there for 4 years. And when I was in Kuwait, and when we were in Kuwait, we were kind of like fish out of water. Our first day in Kuwait, we were comfortable in general. There was no issues, but we were without family, we were without friends, we were without our familiar community. And the major piece of the identity politics that we played on somewhat in Edmonton had flipped. In Edmonton, we were the minority. We were a small group of Muslim students in what would probably be a predominantly non-Muslim university. And now in Kuwait, we were in a Muslim majority country, and our Muslim identity was commonplace. And there also weren't very many Western Muslims in Kuwait near us to connect with. There's a lot to what happened while we were in Kuwait, but to truncate those 4 years into a few sentences, Salwa and I became very, very close friends with another young couple, Matthew and Jessica, who were not Muslim. They were in fact and they are non-denominational Christians. And we spent tons of time together. We traveled together. We consciously chose to live a few feet from one another once we had the chance to move. We celebrated together. We grieved together. And we really shared our lives together over the course of those 4 years. At the time, it seemed to just work, and we talked about our personal connection. We had some similar interests. But when you look at us, if you were on the outside looking at us, we probably didn't have very much in common. In retrospect, I think that there were some broader imperatives that brought us together and sustained our connection during that time. We would both eventually go back home. So Matthew and Jessica went back to the US, we came back to Edmonton. And within a few months, I was back in the Muslim community, slowly building up my level of activism. And one of the initiatives I was a part of was this very wide-ranging community needs assessment that was led by a local Muslim social services organization, the Islamic Family Social Services Association, or IFSA for short. And they were seeking to rebuild and redesign this youth program that they had for several years and needed now to kind of revitalize it. So I participated in developing the questions and also executing the needs assessment. And for those of you who don't know what a needs assessment is, it's basically a listening campaign. It begins with the listening campaign, identifying some common questions that you're going to ask a number of stakeholders, and then you bring those questions or those answers back in a plenary and try to identify some commonalities amongst the answers that the various listeners heard out while talking to community members. So one of the first questions in that needs assessment was this question that you see on your screen, hopefully: to which community do you belong? Because we were interviewing various youth service providers, a large range of individuals, so teachers, police officers, youth workers, youth themselves, well, we thought this was an important demographics question just to be able to cross-reference once we came back to the plenary and we were trying to make sense of the data that we gathered. But what emerged was something far more valuable than just a piece of demographics information that we could cross-reference. The answer that we heard more than once was, I don't really feel like I belong to a community. And that triggered us because some of the people who were saying this were very active people. They were organizing, they were meeting, they were leading things. And it was significant for us to hear those people say, that they don't belong to a community, or that at least they don't feel like they belong to a community. Around that same time, when I had come back to Edmonton, I began some of my master's research at the University of Alberta, back at the U of A, but now as a master's student. And I began to think a little bit about this term, this notion of community academically. And what emerged was a problem of community, because there was a very clear, or what seemed to be a lack of a clear conceptual definition of the term. There was a lack of a clear conceptual definition of the term community. So community can refer to a local neighborhood with a defined geographical boundary, or to a global religious movement that transcends nation states. For Muslims, the word ummah, nation, a worldwide Muslim nation community, is a term that's often used to denote this very large faith community that has no boundary. So defining community itself is a problem, and it's an incredibly warm and persuasive word that gets tossed around a lot, but defining it is difficult. So if I don't know if we can facilitate this through the chat box, but maybe just for ourselves, if we take a moment, and I'll be silent for a minute, and hopefully you'll participate with me on this. If you can, at least in your mind, or if you're jotting things down, then jot it down. If you can take a moment to define community, and don't cheat, don't use Google, just define it for yourself. What is community? Define that right now, and maybe that can be a springboard for conversation when we get into the Q&A. So I'll just pause for a minute while we do that for ourselves.
We can do it over the chat box.
Oh, can we? Cool. Can we?
Yeah.
Would you mind sharing some of the answers that come through?
Sure, I could do that.
Off the top of your head, Stefan, what's community? Or how would you define community?
As someone who works full time with communities,
That's right.
It's very challenging. I guess what you were saying about like being attached to a global phenomenon could be a community, but it might not necessarily be meaningful. In all honesty, I think the most meaningful community is literally like a good neighbor.
Mm.
In my own personal experiences, was like growing up as a kid playing street hockey.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's becoming, you're seeing that happen, or see people recognizing that more and more in Edmonton here. By the way, for folks who are elsewhere in Canada, or maybe elsewhere outside of Canada, it's very warm in Edmonton, so you all should think about moving up here. Yeah, in Edmonton, there's a growing movement of folks who are recognizing the importance of the local neighborhood and being living life in ways that are locally sustainable, and thinking about what it means to actually invest in your local space, and not just moving in for the sake of good interest rates on the mortgage that you might get, or because it's a new build necessarily, but thinking about who you're moving beside, not necessarily just if it's near a highway or if it's near amenities, but thinking about moving near people who are meaningful to you. So hopefully folks have some sort of definitions working in their minds, and even if not, we've problematized this term enough to move on to the next piece. For us, what we thought, let me just pull this up, what we noticed was we had a community, the Edmonton Muslim community, that has estimates ranging around 60,000, upwards of 60,000. And it's a very, very large community. The term Edmonton Muslim community is used all over the place. So it's used obviously in Edmonton, but if you're in Toronto or in Ottawa, or if you're in Montreal or Los Angeles, you're here, they'll attach the city to the phrase Muslim community. And the basic assumption is that if you self-identify as a Muslim, you're a part of the Muslim community. And if you press the folks who said, we don't really feel, or I don't really feel like I belong to a community, if you press them on this, they generally said, yeah, I'm part of the Muslim community, but I don't really feel like I'm part of the Muslim community. And that was a clear sign that there's more to this term community than only identity. There needed to be a way to identify this group of people who may or may not be connected at all, but we had to, they may not have been connected personally to one another, but we needed to recognize that this definition of community needed to be qualified. So the term that we came up with, and it's a term that I've been playing with for a little bit, is de facto community. De facto community is a community that exists in fact or in effect, whether by right or not. It just is. And this is how membership usually works in a faith community like the Muslim community. If you identify with this very large identity piece, i.e. I'm Muslim, then you automatically belong to the Muslim community. This gets played out in various ways. If you've been in the Muslim community for a little while, if you've seen Muslims in action in their centers, you'll see that when somebody makes the choice to self-identify as a Muslim, so they, let's say, convert to Islam and embrace Islam, there's a really strong sense that that person, this new person who just a day before was a neighbor, now is, because they've self-identified as a Muslim, now becomes a member of the community. And that's usually expressed through lots of hugs and a lot of love that's expressed in the immediacy of that moment of that person self-identifying as a Muslim in front of a gathering. But self-identification, we've found, is not good enough for people to really feel rooted within a community. We've actually seen that there are 3 other S's that need to be present in order for a person to be rooted in a collective. This is some of the research that we've gleaned from an important article by Macmillan and Chavez that's entitled Sense of Community, A Definition and Theory. It's in the Journal of Community Psychology, and it was published in 1986. So it's an old journal article, but it actually has a lot of impact still today in our definition of community. So I can't go through all of these S's with a great deal with a lot of detail, but I'm going to go through each one briefly, and hopefully that helps us identify the next piece of the presentation well enough to move on. So sense of community is the first other S beyond self-identification required for a really strong sense of community. And that's best defined as a feeling that members share of belonging, a feeling that members matter to one another and the group, and a shared faith that members' needs will be met through their commitment to be together. In other words, if you have a sense of community, if we have a sense of community in a particular collective, I matter to the other people in that collective, and I matter as a person, not simply as a member of that collective. So if Stefan and I are part of the same community, or we think we're part of the same community, healthy community, I matter to Stefan whether or not I'm a really strong member of the community, a really active member of that community, or if I'm not so active. I matter as a person, and he cares about what happens in my life. He cares when I lose somebody. He cares when I have a child. He cares, and I feel that sense of care, and I reciprocate that care back to him. Shared goals is another piece. So you can imagine if you have a group of folks who are second generation, we'll say Indian Canadians, whose main goal is to reiterate that same cultural expression in the next generation. That's a shared goal, and they'll work together to see that that happens. And if they don't have shared goals, if they have very few shared goals, then the sense of community or their participation or their membership within that smaller community will wane. Safety, hopefully, is pretty self-explanatory, but the notion of safety is that you can enter and leave as needed, and that you can grow as a member of that community without harmful expectation. These 3 additional S's are what we call the characteristics of the intentional community. It's a term that we've borrowed from residential and urban planning, but for us it means a group of people, a collective, who are intentionally connecting to one another and who live in a community. So if we stop for a second and look at this diagram, there are a few key points to note. First of all, the de facto community has not been negated. It's recognized as existing because it exists. In fact, it's kind of a default. It's there because there's a large group of people who self-identify with a large adjective, I guess you can call it. And then the intentional community exists within it. I've only illustrated one intentional community within a de facto community, but you can have multiple expressions of a community within a large community, large de facto community. In the Muslim community, this framework of having intentional communities within a broader Muslim community isn't part of the dominant discourse, or at least that's something that I argue. Generally speaking, the Muslim community within a city is referred to as one unit and one entity. Regardless of how fragmented or divided it is referred to as one, and within that community there are attempts to meet the many needs of those members by establishing institutions. So for the Muslim community, again, this might include mosques, this might include schools, social service organizations, etc. But ultimately, these are institutions which have a particular service that they provide its beneficiaries. Institutions are necessary, but exist for a service. Whether or not all four S's are present is not a major existential question for that institution. So a mosque that offers 5 daily prayers, the Friday prayer, and is open for people to pray in, remains a mosque because it stands as an institution to meet those particular needs. It may have a group of people who have a sense of community, who have shared goals, and who feel that the place is safe. But even if those things are not present, it will remain a mosque. Versus an intentional community that on the one hand is always in the process of building a sense of community, building a sense of, or building shared goals, working on increasing a sense of safety amongst the collective people who self-identify with it. But its primary concern is those 3 additional S's beyond self-identification. If those 3 S's cease to exist entirely, or they stop being a concern of that collective, it's no longer an intentional community. So the big takeaway here, the big takeaway that I'm trying to illustrate here, is that the notion of institution and the notion of community are often conflated. So they're often used interchangeably, but they actually have a lot of distinctions, specifically within a Muslim context. So I'll quote a piece from a blog post by one of my mentors, Usama Cannon, who is the founder of Ta'leef Collective and someone we've worked with at Tarjuma very closely in developing this framework. In a blog post that you can find on their website, he writes, "While the discussion about the relevance of the mosque or the phenomenon of being unmosqued," which if you aren't familiar with, you can simply just Google and take a look at, is mostly centered around the openness of certain buildings, the underlying concerns are linked to a need to belong to a nurturing faith community. This implication is unsettling. This implication is unsettling. Rather than considering the institutions or the buildings that would best serve the Muslim community, we need to first assess the health, the scale, or even the existence of the community. The vast majority of American Muslims might identify with the large and broadly defined national Muslim community. Far fewer, however, would claim full participation in a particular expression of that community as through a local mosque. Continuing the quote, the term, quote, mosque communities appears several times over Zarina Grewal's important book, Islam as a Foreign Country. While Dr. Grewal uses the term for purposes specific to her research, it captures a broadly accepted conceptualization of the Muslim community in the West. Mosques, i.e. the institution. Mosques must be community centers, and all Muslim communities must be centered in mosques. When mosques are deemed the only institutions appropriate for community cultivation, mosque and community become conflated terms. Rather than standing as ideologically neutral space, verily the mosques belong to God, the Quran reminds us, dedicated for devotional worship, they are community centers that shoulder the responsibility of all religious communal life and consequently become highly contested space. So that's a really long explanation of a particular manifestation of the conflation of institution and community, specifically with regards to the Muslim community. And it's something that we think needs to be considered when we are thinking about people who self-identify with a very large broader Muslim community, but who do not feel a sense of connection to other people, who do not feel that their needs are being met, who do not feel like they have safety with groups of people. It may be because the focus has largely been on particular types of institution building rather than community building, and part of that would be becoming comfortable with multiple articulations of community within a single de facto community. It already sort of happens, but being more expressive, being more willing to see it happen more often within a community, I think is important for us to have more people within the broader de facto community feel connected to others. So one of the questions that Stefan was hoping that I would address was how do we do this? What's the process of establishing a intentional community? And I don't have the time to go through all the details right now, but perhaps it's something we can discuss later. But we've come to discover that intentional communities can be planted. It requires a vision, it requires a team, it requires a group of people who are connected to one another, who want to foster the 3 S's, sense of community, shared goals, and safety within that small group, and then who can reach out and grow with an open door policy for folks who just want to come and participate, see how it goes, see how it works for them. And maybe not every intentional community can meet everyone. So in other words, there might be intentional community A that meets the needs and meets the vision of a set group number of people. But there's some people who come and participate and try to participate in that community who just don't feel like it's working for them. In this model, it can happen elsewhere. That person can go and seek another intentional community if there's multiple articulations within the broader community, or they can begin to establish their own. And the way that usually that's seen, if you're talking about institution building, is if that institution is too close to the institution that you seek to exit from, well, that's seen as competition. But with multiple articulations of intentional community, you can have several communities happen working within a broader space, and there's not as much sense of competition that one might originally assume. For Tarjuma, which is the intentional community that we're seeking to plant here in Edmonton, that's something that we're trying to do right now. We're still very much in the early stages. We're just a seed that's been planted, and we're trying to water it and trying to see it grow. We've been doing a lot of research and thinking about the best ways to do this. One thing that we've noticed and we've come to realize is that in order for an intentional community to exist, we have to be willing to own it and be willing to call ourselves a community. Another thing that we've noticed is that we have to, for the people who are beginning to plant it, we have to be willing to participate as full members, not simply as organizers, as volunteers, or as leaders, but it needs to meet our needs. We sort of have to scratch our own itch, so to speak, in order to make this work for ourselves, and then we can reach out to the people who are closely connected to us and grow with those folks over time. So we're still working on it, and we're still trying to figure it out, but the process has been something that we've been trying to develop over the past several months. But before I close, I want to just bring up one last piece. This is a quote from Timothy Keller, who's a prominent pastor in New York City, who was answering a question on Twitter about Generation Y. He's somebody who speaks specifically to an evangelical Christian context, but I think some of the things that he writes are very relevant. In fact, a lot of what we've seen in the evangelical Christian community applies to some of the things that we've been looking at Tarjuma. He was asked, if you could give my generation one piece of advice or encouragement, what would it be? And he answered, you are the generation most afraid of real community because it inevitably limits freedom and choice. Get over your fear. So there's an inherent trade-off. Community, we've come to realize, and people who have participated and lived in community can probably attest to this. Planting certainly intentional community, this is the case certainly for intentional community, is very inconvenient, or often is inconvenient. It naturally limits the freedom that comes with living in a silo. But I believe that for my personal and familial health, those sacrifices are small when compared to the beauty of living and embracing beautiful, open community that allows us to grow closer to one another and grow closer to God. So I'll end there, and I'll turn the mic over to you, Stefan.
Cool, thanks a lot. Are you able to put your camera on so that we can see your lovely face? We're joking before because he kind of looks like either a gamer or now a Qatari airline guy. So maybe you could share that with everybody when we conclude. So now we're in the Q&A period. So we'll take about, you were exactly half an hour. Mashallah.
That's great.
That's really good.
I'm usually never on time, so that's good.
So we'll do some questions, Q&As for about 20 minutes, half an hour, depending on what people are yearning for. For those who are accessing through the Project Communitas website, if you actually click on the YouTube page and you get to the youtube.com page of the webinar, you'll see you can have access to a chat room, so you can ask questions there. For now, I'll start the ball rolling. I want to hear your thoughts a bit when we're talking about communities, and it's interesting because you look at a faith-based community, whether it be the evangelical Christian community that has a pastor or an imam or sort of a person of leadership or a person of mentorship. What do you think is the role of a mentor and a student in that community fabric? So kind of what is the role of the elder and the youth, and what is the role of the mentor and the student?
Mm-hmm. We've really seen the value in intentionally being intergenerational. So what that means is connecting to the people who are closest to us throughout the generations. That means, for me personally, that means my mother. That means my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, my father. People who are connected to me personally need to be participants, need to be sort of, so to speak, members of that community in order for it to be really fulfilling. And we believe that's also true for folks who may not have those connections and may not have the opportunity to have people like that in their lives any longer. For people to have elders to lean on. Intergenerational support is really key for healthy, sustainable communities. We've noticed that, and we've leaned heavily on particular forms of evangelical community planting to help us navigate through the establishment of a new community. There's obviously certain critiques that we have as well of that same process, but nevertheless, one thing that we've noticed is within for a young member of a community to have a really strong sense of themselves, to have a really strong sense of faith, if it's a faith community, there needs to be generally a 5-to-1 ratio of elders to youth. So not only getting wisdom from your mother, your father, or your teacher, but having other people as well, elders who can pour into you, so to speak, provide guidance, provide wisdom, and for those people, ideally to be explicitly identified as, you know, your kind of your elders, your group of elders who you lean on. And we don't really have that those structures officially accessible within the Muslim community, but I do think it's something that we have somewhat unofficially in some ways. So that's one piece that we've seen. That's one thing that we've seen to be very valuable in other faith communities, particularly the evangelical Christian community. And when I say evangelical Christian community, I should mention, when I say that, I'm talking about a very, very, very large, millions wide de facto community, because each of the churches within the evangelical community acts as its own intentional community. So it's rare to hear an evangelical Christian, for example, at least in my experience, identify simply as an evangelical Christian. They usually identify the particular church that they are part of, and that's an indication that that's not the building they attend, because it may very well be that that church is functioning out of a arena or a community hall or a school, but they're identifying a particular group of people that they're connected to. With regards to leadership and mentorship, that's another piece that's really key. The establishment of these communities is a lifelong journey that requires an incredible deal of sacrifice amongst those people who choose to plant it. And if you're going to be doing something difficult and arduous, then you need to have mentors to help you through that process. Especially, I mean, ideally people who've gone through the process already themselves who can help you through. And I think we do have that in the Muslim community, the broader Muslim community, folks who've given so much of their lives to establish the things that they've established. I think the challenges for people who will be establishing intentional communities in the years to come, if folks choose to do this, will be not having a large group of people who've done this particular type of people work, because the imperative for my parents' generation, for example, who were immigrants to Canada, was to establish institutions, because the assumption was the community exists, we're Indian Muslims who are here in Canada, so we need to have a mosque or a school or something to provide services for people within this community. What's happened today though, is that you have people who identify, who get to choose the tribe, so to speak, to belong to, and establishing this so-called modern tribe, nurturing it, cultivating it, being willing to lead from a place of brokenness and vulnerability is something that's necessary, required, and maybe not something that's that we have a lot of access to, specifically in the context of, you know, Edmonton or Ottawa or Toronto or Los Angeles or wherever people might be listening to this from. Yeah, so I think mentorship is really key, and I think a lot of it for the time being will be accessing mentors in certain fields, and recognizing them as mentors in certain fields. So, for example, that might be in certain realms of pastoral care, but a lot of peer-to-peer mentorship as we kind of go through this process of this kind of what I think is a new phase of community development in the West.
Mm-hmm. Cool. That's awesome. Are there any other questions? Please feel free to share. If not, I have one myself. We could go on and on. And actually, one of the challenges that I've seen working across Canada is really dealing with youth programming, and dealing with also relevant programming. Is that you'll see a lot of questions on what is relevant programming for young people, what is relevant programming for elders, what is relevant programming for parents, etc. And so that's actually a challenge that many institutions, whether it be faith-based or secular institutions, that want to reach out, you end up doing a project, or you end up doing an initiative, or you end up doing a meeting, and you're preaching to the converted, so to speak. So say you want to do some outreach, your outreach is very much limited because the subject of your outreach is limited to a particular group of people. Do you find that an intentional community can be would have that as a challenge, where you're kind of limiting yourself as being culturally irrelevant for many people that are part of the broader community? And if so, how would you address that challenge?
I think the question about youth it's very interesting, because as somebody who grew up in youth spaces, I guess, within institutions of the Muslim community, that was something that we kind of we knew was the case, but we really didn't know how to address it. So our attempts of being relevant was to like play soccer and basketball and to, you know, throw a pizza party, and somehow that was going to meet our needs, and we would have a really strong sense of self because, you know, Muslims eat pizza too or something. But that model doesn't meet the many needs that youth, for example, have. I think the in an intentional community, what we envision is generations. So first of all, I think the one piece is, you know, we envision an intentional community being something that is decades in development and exists for decades, and someone may be born into an intentional community and live their entire lives in that same intentional community, and that type of nurturing and that type of sense of place, I don't think is something that you find often today. So a youth, I think we're talking about contextually speaking, a youth who grows up in an intentional community, who's been participating and connected with children of who are also in that community over time, is facing different challenges than somebody who's totally disconnected. And of course, people will be coming in at different points of their life. So you'll have elders who are coming in, you'll have youth who are coming in, middle-aged folk, young families, etc. But I think that there is that challenge still exists, because I think the default for a lot of faith communities is to bring folks together, bring youth together, say, here's a list of don'ts. Here's your list of don'ts. Make sure you don't do this. Make sure you don't do this. And then at the end of it, be like pizza party, and let's just have some pizza and let's celebrate. And I don't know if that meets youth's needs. I think that a youth in the Muslim community, for example, probably needs the same sorts of things that I need as like a nearly 30-year-old Muslim guy who's grown up in the community. I need companionship, I need friendship, and I'm also hoping that I can have some mentorship where I can be really vulnerable and open and honest with people about the struggles that I have, because my belief is that people are inherently good, and that sometimes things get in the way and experiences get in the way, and certain things can hinder us from reaching our inherent goodness. But I need to have a place where I can be open about that, and somebody can help me work through that. And I think that often, because we're thinking about programming doesn't give way for that to happen, because a program only exists for a short period of time. Are we connecting to people? Are we connecting kids to kids? And are we saying to those kids in that group, for example, to say, hey, yo, we need to be open, honest, vulnerable here, and we're gonna mess up. We need to figure this out together, because our connection together is more important than the mess ups that you have, or the mess ups that we might experience or we might see about each other. And imagine if that happens when you're a child. So imagine a kid who comes in who's part of an intentional community and whose parents are going through a divorce. My parents went through a divorce when I was fairly young, and I was fortunate to have a lot of support around me, but I know a lot of people who didn't have support. So imagine if somebody was there to reinforce, not, an elder, of course, to reinforce that, hey, look, it's not your fault, for example, and these things happen, but you're still loved and you're still cared for here, and you're probably still cared for within your family as well. But then also having children who are buttressing that support from up above. That doesn't happen if people aren't meeting regularly. You see, like if you can't throw on a child support night, or you can't throw on a youth vulnerability night. It doesn't happen like that. We have to have regular, predictable spaces where that happens, and then I think people will, that kind of naturally emerges, and the programs are just there to kind of like celebrate some of the beautiful stuff happening within that collective.
Cool. We have another question that came in. So are we seeking through institutions, organizations to replicate traditional communities? And how does that fit in with modern concepts like the safe space?
Yeah. It's interesting. It's so interesting. I'm trying to, I don't want to talk for like 15 minutes until the end. So I'll try to keep my comments to the point. Yeah, safe space. Yeah, safe space was one of the things that, and hopefully I answer the question. I should mention this at the top, because if I go into tangents and I don't answer the question, call me on that. Safe space is the concept that we all started with, actually, because here's the context. I'm a Muslim kid, grew up in the Muslim community, and the assumption of growth in a community is the building of a new mosque. That's just how it's, or a school or some other institution. There has to be an institution that's built in order for there to be healthy growth within a community. And if we're growing buildings, if we're increasing the number of buildings, then what should that new building look like? Or what should that new space look like? Well, maybe we don't know exactly what the physical characteristics of that space are, but we can maybe say that it's a safe space. And let's talk about what that means. So we spent a long time at Tarjuma, at least early on in 2012, after we had done the needs assessment and eventually established Tarjuma as an official community thing. At that point, we hadn't called it a community, an intentional community. We were playing with notions of safe space. And I think a lot of that was springboarded off of the conversation about the mosque, frankly speaking, because we had all experienced, myself included, experienced lots of really disorienting experience in the various mosques that I had attended either as a youth or as an adult, spaces that I tried to attend together with my wife. Yeah, so we talked about safe space a lot. What we came to realize later on was that maybe we weren't talking so much about the space and we're talking about the people. So to answer the question around traditional community, I don't know if we're talking about establishing traditional communities through organizations and institutions. I think that there's an organizational, maybe an institutional element to that. But the modern context is such that traditional communities rarely exist. Something that TJ Winter, Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, for those of you who are familiar with him, he's a lecturer at Cambridge University, an eminent scholar. One of the things he mentions is that in a traditional society, or in a traditional Muslim society, for example, you would have an extended family, I should say, living within a single quarters, and the nuclear family would be a natural growth within that extended family. So physically speaking, they'd be living in the same courtyard space maybe, and a lot of your needs were met. So for example, even if women were staying at home with children, by and large, there were still other people there to watch kids if the mother needed to go out for other things. There was a support base built into the basic organizing units of society. Fast forward to modern day, and just speaking about myself, that's just, I live very close to family, but I don't live in the same house as family. And we live separate lives, and we live independently of one another, as probably is the case for most people. So if a mother lives at home with her children, that might sound very traditional, but her living at home with with a couple of children, let's say within the confines of four walls, without any access to the outside world, unless there's paid babysitting while the husband is at work, that's not a very traditional way of living. So what we're thinking about is, how do we translate some of the broader imperatives of traditional community life in ways that make sense for our modern context? So that might mean translating some of those things, some of those supports. One thing that we've thought about is, at our weekly gathering, which is something we haven't started yet, Tarjuma hopes to start a weekly gathering in August, God willing. So at that weekly gathering, normally in the Muslim community, that involves everyone, and we do intend for everyone to come. But if you're a young family, bringing kids to a gathering like that to just kind of hang out, listen to something, gain some knowledge, participate in some content sharing, it's difficult because your children need you. And then you're also thinking about the sensibilities of the people around you. You're trying to keep your kid quiet. There's a whole bunch of things that go through your mind when you're a young family in that space. So one thing that we've picked up is there has to be child-specific programming. There has to be kid stuff happening at the same time. And it can't be, you can't just throw kids in a room and throw a teenager in there and say, watch the kids. That's not adequate. And that might sound funny. It might sound kind of obvious as well to people who are listening, but that's actually often the case with a lot of community initiatives within the broader Muslim community. The idea of, like, if there's childcare, if there's stuff happening for children, then all we need to do is get a teenager to sit in the room, and then the kids will be fine. As long as they stay alive, we're a success. Well, what would it mean for those kids to be participating on that weekly basis while the parents are listening to content and engaging with adults, in community, to be also having meaningful content? And for a toddler, that just might mean having a really loving community member watch over them, and sing with them and play with them. And then what would happen then if those children met weekly, and if those adults met weekly, and if there's youth as well, then youth met weekly? That's not very traditional. I don't think that's a very traditional structure. But what we see in that is a modern structure to meet a traditional aim, which is sharing life with one another. Another small example that we've picked up in our research was, we've noticed that a lot of, and I think this might be true across the board, we've noticed that a lot of young families do not have husband and wife, the husband and the wife, if they're both working, one's working, doesn't matter what the case is, they often don't have time to kick it. Like, they don't, if you want to go on a date night, you either have to call up family and disrupt family, or, hopefully they're cool with it, or you need to hire a babysitter. And that's inhibiting for people who don't have the financial means to do that. And then if you don't have family, then you don't have family. So what do you do? So one thing that we've picked up, and a few people within Tarjuma have begun to practice, is this thing that we picked up from a book called Sticky Faith, which was a longitudinal study that came out of Fuller Theological Seminary, around what sorts of things do families do that, in the evangelical context, that allow for those kids, or help those kids stick to their faith after they leave the family and after they leave home. So what things make faith sticky? An obvious point was that parents are really connected. Like husband and wife are really connected in cases that where they're still married. And if they're not married, if it's a divorce situation, then there's other things to talk about. But in case they're still married, well, how often are they getting time alone to kind of go out and connect with one another? And by and large, people aren't getting enough time. So how do you facilitate within a community the same sorts of things that were happening in a traditional community that Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad or TJ Winter talks about, but in a modern context? So the actual practical structure is called a date night kid swap. So once every 2 weeks, myself and Salwa will watch kids of another couple, and the kids will kind of hang out and they'll play, and that couple, the other couple, will go out and have a date and do whatever, watch a movie, etc., etc., etc. And we'll be watching the kids, and we'll have dinner with the kids, and we'll play with the kids, and the kids are connecting, and we're connected because we're trying to manage, like, juggle 4 kids at the same time. And the next week or 2 weeks later, vice versa. So we drop off the kids at the other person's house, and we allow them, the kids, to play, and then we go out on our own date. That sounds really simple, but those types of things, if they're not facilitated, I think, in communities, you can have couples who don't go out, as we've seen, for years, like literally years. And those are the types of quiet stuff happening underneath a lot of the stuff that gets a lot of the publicity, that doesn't help facilitate a really strong sense of community amongst youth, amongst children, and certainly amongst the couple who haven't gone out for like a year and a half. I know that was a very long-winded answer. I hope I answered some of it.
No, I think that was great. So we have about 8 minutes left. So we're quite short on time. So I'm gonna leave I'll get the stream to you. I was gonna say the floor, but it's more of a stream. Do you have any other thoughts that you'd like to add, or any other ideas or recommendations for especially young people that are in the process of building community, but also in the process, the people who are getting out of that university community and beginning to enter that kind of, I'm a professional and I might buy a house and I might not know where to go. And because we're seeing a lot of these people are taking paths that could be dangerous, whether it be paths that are alienating, but also paths that are that might be violent or that might be dangerous. So what would be some of your recommendations on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For folks who are leaving university, I think the first thing is we need to become very fluent around the challenges that they're facing. It was something that I had so when you're about to go into university, if you're somebody who's in the Muslim community, you're put on guard. You're told, like, watch out for this, watch out for that, watch out for this, because these are things that might pop up. Rarely do we have an exit strategy for folks who are leaving. It's like they just kind of go off and they float away, and we'll see you when we see you, maybe. But we might want to think about, what does it look like for a farewell? What does it look like to say, hey, look, you're leaving now, and you'll never feel like you're part of this community again. It just won't happen. For folks who know what the Muslim Students Association is, and if you've been part of the MSA, like the world's most active member in the MSA, you did everything from, like, buy samosas and run them back to, like, the Jumu'ah prayer to whatever it might be. And then you leave and you come back a few years later, you don't feel at home. At least I don't feel at home, and the people I've spoken to don't feel at home. So, being frank about, check this out. After you leave, you're not going to feel at home again. I mean, you might feel at home for the next few months because you still see all the faces, but this is a very transient community. People are going to come in and come out, and we've had the fortune of having chance encounters, and we've had the fortune of being on a very similar journey as we go through our academic careers. But once this is done, it's over. And guess what? Afterwards, there might not be anything there for you. So let's think about ways to do that. Let's think about ways to connect. And I think it has to happen at a very personal level. So I don't know if we have to wait for institutions to help us do this, but I think that people need to think about, myself included, and so I'm kind of speaking to myself as I was leaving university. You know, if I were leaving university after having been in such a really strong community over several years, what type of advice would I be giving myself? Some of the advice would be, remember that you're going to be losing a lot of your bearings when you get out there. A lot of the things that you took for granted are going to become apparent that that you took them for granted. And who specifically are the people that you're going to connect to? Who are the people that you're going to remain connected to? And are those are those people interested in the same sorts of community building that you're interested in? I think a small way to do that, like to get practical for a moment, is to think about connecting weekly with people. Well, our lives are organized into weeks, and generally speaking, we can kind of get the ebb and the flow of a week. We can kind of put our finger on the pulse of a week, if you so to speak. So, what's happening on the weekly? What's the weekly pulse going to be? Bump daily, bump the monthly, bump the yearly for a moment, and just think weekly, what's happening on the weekly. And if we can't think about what's happening on the weekly, we're probably in a danger zone. We might be in the danger zone for something really, problematic, like violence or extremism or things like that. That can definitely happen, especially if you feel isolated from real human contact, from the people you trust and the people that you've been sitting with in community for a while, and then you start to seek out community elsewhere. Like our, the webinar last week mentioned on Twitter, for example. The primary means to which you get community is over tweeting, to people that you may not have never met. Or it might just mean that you begin to feel really isolated and become very disappointed with the particular services you kind of hope that the organizations would provide but aren't going to provide. I think taking agency and saying that I'm going to do it for myself, I'm going to do it with a group of people that I have is really key. And we don't have the resources yet to offer to everyone, but we are in the process of developing that at Tarjuma, and we hope that we can do it for ourselves and then hopefully guide other folks who are on that journey.
Cool. Thank you very much, Farooq. Thank you very much for those who stuck with us, and the video will be made accessible. So if there are some key points that you'd like to share with anybody, please feel free to share widely. So I'd like to thank our esteemed guest. It was very insightful, and we live in a very interesting time where a lot of us, as was mentioned by the pastors, a lot of us don't have that community, don't know what that community is, and aren't willing to take that sacrifice to build community and to have community. So hopefully we take some of your insights and put it into practice. So thank you very much. Have a beautiful evening. I know you're still at work, so
Right.
Go home.
Thank you.
And,
I shall.
We'll reconnect soon. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Have a good night.
Thank you.